Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
You're just not agile enough for where the company is headed, Carl said, smiling that smug, rehearsed smile that always felt like it belonged in a car dealership more than a leadership meeting. I sat across from him in one of those sleek, glass-walled conference rooms they installed last year, the kind where everyone outside can see in, like we're part of some HR-sanctioned fish tank. My palms were resting on the faux wood table, still warm from the coffee I had been holding 10 minutes earlier, back when I thought this was going to be a routine check-in. The words hit like a sucker punch to the gut, not because they were true, they weren't, but because they were so transparently designed to sound like constructive feedback while carrying the unmistakable stench of premeditated dismissal. I had been here 12 years. 12. I led 34 projects from kickoff to delivery, many of them ahead of schedule and under budget, back when Agile was still a buzzword people tossed around to sound relevant at networking events. I trained half the project leads they had now, wrote the templates for their implementation plans, and was one of the core people who helped navigate the company through the chaos of the early pandemic days. And now I was being told, with a straight face, that I didn't fit the culture anymore. Carl leaned back in his chair like a man who had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror, elbows out, voice calm, eyes soft but firm in that TED Talk kind of way. He said things like strategic alignment and cultural evolution, which really meant that he wanted to fill the room with his own guys, preferably ones who had never had to explain to a client why a server crash at 2 a.m. wouldn't delay the go live. Guys like Ryan, 29 MBA, wore sneakers with suits and called himself a solutions architect, despite having zero background in architecture or, frankly, solutions. Ryan had shadowed me for 6 weeks, and the only thing he'd contributed was a rebranding of our internal tracker that added 3 clicks and no value. It wasn't that Carl hated me, exactly. He just didn't see a use for someone who couldn't be shaped into his ideal of a startup-minded, stand-up desk-hopping, jargon-spouting cheerleader for change. I'd been managing projects before Carl even graduated college. He was all about pivoting and disrupting, and I was all about finishing things. On time, properly tested, and with minimal drama. But that wasn't sexy anymore. That didn't play well in PowerPoints. So I sat there, listening to this man who had never managed a project larger than a bake sale tell me that my workflow cadence didn't reflect the adaptive mindset of the company's future. I wanted to laugh, or yell, or call out every single thing I had bailed this place out of, like the time we had to rebuild an entire client dashboard over a weekend because the new dev team, nature Carl's idea, had pushed untested code to production. But instead, I did something that, in hindsight, pissed him off more than any protest ever could. I smiled. I stood up, reached across the table, and shook his hand. I thanked him, calmly, politely, and said, "I think we're done here." Because the truth was, something had shifted inside me. Somewhere between "you're not agile" and "we wish you the best," I realized I was being freed, not laid off, not fired. Freed from endless sprint reviews with people who didn't understand the meaning of velocity. Freed from 3-hour meetings about 2-minute fixes. Freed from being the guy who everyone leaned on but never promoted. I walked out of that room with my spine straight and my conscience clean, but I won't lie, my pride was bleeding out on the floor behind me. Over the next few days, the word spread fast. Some of the old guard, people I mentored, people who knew what I brought to the table, texted or called, stunned, some even angry. A few younger folks whispered that it was a shame, but then quickly moved on, as they're trained to do in corporate. You don't dwell in the era of Slack and OKRs. You move, you optimize, you survive. Still, my inbox told a different story. Former clients, cross-department leads, quiet thank yous. "You always had our back. Never forgot how you saved that rollout. They're making a mistake." But Carl? He strutted through the halls like he just decluttered the attic. I didn't pack my things dramatically or slam the door. I took my time, cleared out my desk, left a folder with handover notes, even left a spare charger I knew someone would need. No petty emails, no bitter exit speech. But inside? Inside, I was replaying the moment like a war movie. Every version of what I could have said, what I should have said. And still, the only thing that echoed louder than my exit was the truth I couldn't shake. After 12 years of loyalty, sacrifice, missed birthdays, weekend calls, and 2 a.m. crisis calls, I was disposable, just like that, because I wasn't agile enough. What would you do if your boss stabbed you in the back like this? Would you walk away with dignity or burn it all down on the way out? Either way, I wasn't done with Carl. Not by a long shot. It's a strange thing, waking up on a Monday morning and realizing you're no longer part of the machine. Not just any machine, but the one you helped build, bolt by bolt, sprint by sprint. For over a decade, the one whose gears you greased with your own hours, sacrificed weekends, missed family dinners, and those sleep-deprived all-nighters fixing things no one else could even diagnose. For the first time in 12 years, I wasn't checking a backlog or combing through Gantt charts with a mug of lukewarm coffee balanced between unread Slack messages. Instead, I sat in my kitchen, sunlight spilling across the tiles in a way I had never noticed before, with no agenda, no meetings, and absolutely no idea what came next. The first week off felt almost like a staycation, that brief window where your body's still decompressing and your mind keeps nudging you to check your work email even though you don't have access anymore. But then the novelty wore off fast. There's something humiliating about opening LinkedIn to update your status and seeing Carl post a 3-paragraph celebration of organizational recalibration. His face smug in a selfie with the new team behind him, younger, hungrier, and very clearly thrilled to be featured on the company page, as if getting rid of people like me was a victory for progress. He didn't name me, of course, but anyone who'd worked there longer than 5 minutes knew exactly what had happened. Making space for innovation, he called it, building agility through strategic evolution. I nearly threw my coffee at the screen, but I didn't have to stew for long, because within 10 days, my phone started buzzing. Not with job offers or interview requests, but with quiet, nervous messages from people still trapped in that glass tower. First, it was Amanda, one of the senior QA leads who had always worked quietly, efficiently, never one to complain, but her text was laced with panic. "Hey, I don't know if you've heard, but the system Carl rolled out last week crashed during UAT. Production's at a standstill. He's blaming the devs." Then came Marcus from Ops, who told me Ryan sent a test build to the client environment without flagging QA, and the rollback failed because someone, Carl again, had approved removing the backup automation process to speed up deployment. My jaw dropped. That process existed because I fought tooth and nail for it after we almost lost a client to a data wipe 3 years ago. It was like watching a building catch fire in slow motion. Every day brought another update, another symptom of the disease they tried to ignore when they cut me loose. Meetings spiraling into blame games, documentation disappearing into version control hell, and high-profile clients either demanding explanations or outright leaving. Carl apparently had tried to take over the project portfolio reviews himself, but couldn't answer basic questions about milestones, risk matrices, or even what deliverables were due. And Ryan? He was mostly working remotely, which everyone knew meant hiding while the real damage played out. Meanwhile, the same executives who nodded solemnly during my exit handshake were now scheduling late-night calls and emergency town halls. And while it was oddly validating to see the empire start to crumble without me, it was also gut-wrenching. I didn't want to feel bitter, but I couldn't ignore the sting every time someone messaged to say, "We really miss your structure," or "This place hasn't been the same since you left." One junior dev I'd mentored, Lena, called me just to vent. Said she was stuck in a code freeze loop because no one remembered how to approve deployment workflows without my documentation, which, of course, had been removed in Carl's streamlining purge. But what hit hardest was the quiet, the sudden absence of purpose. You don't realize how much of your identity is tied to your role until it's yanked from you without warning. I found myself pacing around the house, looking at half-finished home improvement projects, trying to distract myself with books I never had time to read, while the gnawing sensation at the pit of my stomach kept whispering that maybe I really was past my prime, that maybe Carl was right. And then came the financial stress. I wasn't broke, but let's just say my emergency fund wasn't built for a midlife gap year. My wife, bless her, tried to keep things upbeat. She joked about finally having a breakfast partner, said it was good I wasn't losing sleep over other people's chaos anymore, but I could see the worry in her eyes every time we looked at the budget together. We'd made sacrifices for my career, sacrifices I had always justified by saying I was building something stable, something long-term. And now that stability was gone, replaced by a gaping uncertainty that no resume refresh or bootcamp certification could instantly fix. Still, there was a small, almost imperceptible shift inside me, like a sliver of metal slowly turning toward a magnetic field. Because in the middle of all the chaos, all the regret, and all the lost sleep, something else started to grow. The undeniable realization that the place hadn't run because of the process. It hadn't run because of the brand, or the tools, or the slogans. It had run because of me. And without me, it was falling apart faster than anyone could have predicted. What came next wasn't a grand epiphany or a revenge fantasy. It was a call, simple, unassuming, and utterly drenched in desperation. But that's a story for tomorrow. It was a Thursday afternoon, that kind of gray, overcast day, where the light hangs lazily in the windows, and you can't tell if it's late morning or early evening, and I was halfway through unclogging a bathroom sink when my phone buzzed against the counter, the caller ID flashing the company name I hadn't seen in over a month, and for a moment, I just stared at it, my hands still wet, the drain snake coiled next to me like some absurd metaphor for the corporate mess I'd been dragged through and left behind. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring out once, then twice, because something in me wanted them to feel a little of the waiting, a little of the uncertainty they'd so casually handed to me without blinking. By the time I finally picked up, my voice was calm, controlled, and disinterested in a way that I could tell immediately made the person on the other end nervous. It was Martin, the director of product, not Carl, which told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. Martin was one of those steady, no-nonsense types who rarely got involved in people drama, which made it all the more revealing that he was the one calling. He didn't waste much time on pleasantries. He started by asking how I was holding up, which felt more like a formality than genuine concern, and then he dropped it. They were in trouble, deep enough that the usual band-aids weren't sticking anymore, and the board was starting to ask some uncomfortable questions about why the Q3 roadmap was weeks behind with no sign of progress, why 2 enterprise clients had walked away mid-negotiation, and why the internal chatter on the anonymous feedback channels read like a disaster post-mortem. I didn't say much at first. I let him talk, let him outline the problems like I hadn't already heard them from the half-dozen people still feeding me information from the inside. Apparently, Ryan had tried to rework the prioritization matrix, but ended up deleting half the backlog items by accident. And Carl, ever the confident visionary, decided to bypass QA entirely on one deployment to regain momentum, which resulted in a corrupted user database and a very public apology to a Fortune 100 client. The kicker? Carl told the board that the failures were due to legacy system complexity, which was his roundabout way of blaming me without having the spine to say my name. So there it was. The quiet, awkward confession that maybe, just maybe, they'd made a mistake. And Martin, seasoned diplomat that he was, finally said it. We'd like to bring you back on a temporary basis, consulting capacity, flexible terms. The words hung in the air, a lifeline coated in corporate vagueness, and I almost laughed, because it wasn't just desperation, it was a quiet plea, the kind that people like Carl would never personally utter, which is why they sent someone else to make the call. I told Martin I'd think about it, and I meant it, because the truth is, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. Part of me wanted to slam the door in their faces to remind them exactly what they'd thrown away when they decided buzzwords and branding mattered more than results and reliability. But another part of me, the quieter, more strategic part, saw something else entirely. An opportunity not just to return, but to come back on my own terms, with leverage, clarity, and a long memory of every slight they thought I had quietly buried. So I gave it a few days, not because I needed the time, but because I wanted them to sweat, to feel the weight of uncertainty that had been dropped on my shoulders when they pushed me out. And during that time, I sat down with a legal friend of mine and had a long, detailed conversation about contract terms, non-disclosure agreements, intellectual property clauses, and the fine print that most people never bother reading until it's too late. I wanted everything in writing: autonomy over scope, full access to data systems, freedom from reporting directly to Carl, and a rate high enough to make their finance team wince. And to my surprise, they agreed. No haggling, no pushback, just signatures and fast-tracked onboarding. But I didn't walk back in as the same man they'd forced out. I returned as a consultant, not an employee, which meant I wasn't bound by the same loyalties, wasn't tied to the same expectations, and most importantly, wasn't there to save anyone, not Carl, not Ryan, not even the brand. I was there to assess, to advise, to observe. And with that new role came a freedom I hadn't felt in years, the freedom to speak the truth without fear of HR, to document what I saw without concern for politics, and to finally put into motion the quiet strategy that had been forming ever since I walked out of that glass room. I started slow, asked questions, took notes, read every change log, every incident report, every thread in the project tracker that showed just how far things had spiraled. And while I was at it, I started pulling old data, emails, Slack threads, archived documentation, not to be petty, but to build a record, a timeline, a forensic trail of what had gone wrong and why. And every step of the way, I kept my voice calm, my presence minimal, and my intentions close to the chest, because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't there for redemption. I was there for the reckoning. From the moment I walked back through those tinted glass doors, wearing a contractor badge that hung a little heavier than it should have, I knew the dynamic had shifted, not just in title or chain of command, but in something far more foundational, something intangible that lives in the way people glance up when you pass, or in how voices quiet slightly when you enter a meeting. I wasn't one of them anymore, not because I had changed in skill or in purpose, but because I now carried a different kind of authority, not the formal, policy-backed kind, but the kind that comes from being underestimated, dismissed, and then proven indispensable when the fire's already burning through the walls. Carl avoided me at first, which I found both predictable and hilarious in equal measure. He'd pop into meetings only briefly, offering vague, overpolished insights before ducking out under the guise of executive strategy sessions, leaving me with teams that were fractured, demoralized, and stretched so thin that even basic operations were collapsing under the weight of overlapping deadlines and unclear priorities. What struck me the most wasn't the chaos. I had expected that, even welcomed it in a grim sort of way, but how quickly the teams fell back into rhythm the moment someone gave them clarity. Not force, not noise, just clarity. In my first 2 weeks, I rebuilt the project tracker from scratch, not because I wanted to prove a point, but because the one Ryan designed had more holes than a colander, with priority tags assigned like raffle tickets and no documentation trails to speak of. I reintroduced version control policies, restored the deployment protocols Carl had discarded in his rush to streamline, and brought back a regular cadence of cross-functional syncs, the kind of mundane but critical rituals that keep an operation from spiraling into anarchy. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't disruptive, but the effect was immediate and undeniable. Deadlines started being met, incident reports dropped by over 40%, and most telling of all, engineers began to voluntarily work late again, not because they were forced to, but because they believed once again that what they were doing actually mattered. But I wasn't just there to play janitor. While I patched up the ship, I was also digging, Not vindictively, not haphazardly, but with precision and patience, like an archaeologist peeling back layers of sand to find the real cause of death beneath the ceremonial mask. And what I found was far worse than I had imagined. Carl hadn't just made poor decisions, he had actively covered up failures. He had backdated approvals to make it look like client feedback had been integrated when it hadn't, quietly removed QA test reports from the shared drives when they contradicted his launch timelines, and, perhaps most damning, manipulated Jira logs to hide the fact that several key deliverables were signed off without peer review. Now, if you've never worked in product or project management, you might think this kind of thing is just par for the course, a little grease in the gears, a little fudging for the sake of appearances. But in our world, where compliance is law and transparency is trust, that kind of manipulation doesn't just threaten a quarter's revenue, it endangers the entire foundation of how teams operate. So I started documenting every discrepancy, every deleted file, every altered timestamp. I didn't confront anyone directly because I wasn't there to start a war. I was there to build a record so clean and complete that even the most skeptical executive couldn't deny what it revealed. 3 weeks in, I requested a session with the board, framed it as a project health overview, which in their language meant a PowerPoint and a few charts that made them feel informed. But what I brought was something far more surgical. Slide by slide, I walked them through the current state of operations, the improvements since I returned, the risks still unresolved, the cost of the downtime they'd suffered under Carl's watch. I showed them a timeline of incidents and overlaid it with internal decisions and removed compliance checkpoints. And then, in one quiet, deliberate transition, I pulled up the Jira audit logs, highlighted the backdated entries, and pointed to a specific client escalation that had gone unreported for 6 weeks, while Carl sent emails to the board celebrating operational momentum. The silence that followed was the kind of silence you don't interrupt. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even shocked. It was the kind of silence that comes when people realize they've been complicit, not actively but passively, by looking away for too long, by mistaking noise for competence. Carl, sitting at the far end of the room, tried to speak, something about context and dynamic variables, but his words collapsed under the weight of the evidence I had laid out with calm, clinical precision. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply stated, plainly and clearly, that the integrity of the company's systems had been compromised, and that moving forward, operational transparency needed to be reinstated, not as a best practice, but as a mandate. When I walked out of that room, no one said a word. Not to me, not to Carl. The next day, Ryan was removed from his special projects post and reassigned to a non-client-facing role. Carl, for the first time in his tenure, was placed under a formal performance review. And I kept working, quietly, methodically. But now people came to me with questions instead of hiding from them. My email signature didn't carry a title of power, but my calendar was booked solid with leaders seeking guidance. It wasn't revenge, not in the way movies would have you believe. There were no dramatic confrontations or shouting matches or shredded resignation letters thrown onto mahogany desks. But it was justice, the slow, undeniable kind that doesn't just expose failure, but replaces it with something stronger, something earned. And as I updated the roadmap that afternoon, checking boxes in Jira with a steady hand, I smiled, not because I had one, but because I had proven, in the most undeniable way, that the only thing more agile than their new culture was a man with nothing left to lose and everything still left to prove. There's a strange kind of calm that settles in when you've already played your hand, laid every card face up on the table, and watched the expressions of the people who once thought they held all the power slowly shift from indifference to disbelief, and finally to the uneasy silence of self-preservation. In the weeks following that pivotal board meeting, I kept showing up, kept fulfilling the terms of my contract with mechanical precision, fixing what could be fixed, stabilizing what had been teetering on the edge of collapse and quietly mentoring the few bright, sharp minds still left in the building who hadn't yet been dulled by corporate mediocrity or driven to apathy by a system that rewarded flash over substance. But all the while, I knew, and they knew, that the end was drawing near, not in a dramatic, fire the boss kind of way, but in the quiet, undeniable realization that they could no longer pretend the house hadn't been burning long before I walked back through those doors. Carl, for his part, became a ghost of himself, no longer striding through hallways with that insufferable bounce in his step, or holding court in meetings with his signature blend of condescension and shallow buzzwords. He was still technically in charge, his name still etched on the org chart with a title that sounded important but had lost all substance. Yet his influence had all but vanished, eroded by the simple, persistent truth that he had been caught, not just in failure, but in deliberate obfuscation, in the kind of decisions that don't just tank deliverables, but erode trust at the molecular level of an organization. I didn't have to say a word to him in those final days. The silence between us was its own kind of reckoning, a space heavy with unspoken truths and the understanding that while he might still have a job for now, his legacy had already been rewritten in the margins of every report I left behind. My contract was set to expire on a Friday, 3 months to the day from when Martin first called me, voice trembling with urgency, to ask for help without ever quite admitting they needed it. And I could have stayed. That was the unspoken offer behind every "thank you for your incredible work," behind the execs who suddenly found time to swing by my desk with a coffee or an unsolicited update on how we're realigning vision across leadership. There were whispers of extending the engagement, of potentially carving out a full-time leadership role, and even one semi-formal conversation where I was asked, delicately, what it would take to bring me back into the fold permanently. But by then, I had already made my decision, and it wasn't just about pride or proving a point. It was about principle, about finally stepping out of a system that had taken my loyalty for granted, that had squeezed every ounce of value from me and tossed me aside the moment I didn't fit into someone's superficial narrative of agility. So on that final day, I wore the same jacket I'd worn the day Carl fired me. Not out of pettiness, but as a kind of quiet bookend, a personal reminder of who I was then and who I had become in the aftermath. I handed over my final report. Not just a summary of what had been done, but a blueprint for what needed to be sustained if they wanted to avoid falling back into the same pit of dysfunction. I shook a lot of hands that day, accepted a few awkward thank yous, and even allowed myself a short, private moment with the team leads who had stuck it out, the ones who had worked alongside me in the trenches and helped pull the operation back from the edge, not because they were told to, but because they believed, as I once did, in doing things right. Carl approached me just as I was walking toward the exit, his expression carefully neutral, the kind of face a man wears when he's rehearsed a dozen different versions of a conversation and still isn't sure which one to use. He extended his hand and said, "No hard feelings, I hope." And I took it, firm and brief, locking eyes with him for just long enough to let him know that while I held no malice, I also had no intention of forgetting. "It's business," I replied, and let the silence do the rest. But I didn't walk straight out that door. Before I left, I stopped by HR, not to sign anything, not to chat, but to drop off a single envelope, unsealed, with my name printed neatly on the front. Inside was a formal, fully documented age discrimination complaint, complete with emails, meeting notes, and timelines. I wasn't filing it. I wasn't suing anyone. But I wanted it in their system. I wanted it on their radar. And most importantly, I wanted them to know that I could have gone scorched earth, but chose not to. Because the truth is, I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to see Carl fired, or to hear apologies that wouldn't mean a thing. What I needed was to walk out on my own terms, head high, dignity intact, knowing that I had been the adult in the room the entire time. I needed to reclaim my narrative, to prove, to myself more than anyone, that being cast aside didn't mean I was finished, and that value isn't defined by title, age, or how many times you say pivot in a meeting. Later that night, I sat on my back porch, a glass of something strong in my hand, watching the wind bend through the trees like it had somewhere to go. And, for the first time in years, I didn't feel tethered to someone else's timeline or shackled by someone else's limitations. I felt free. Not in the cheesy self-help book way, but in the deep, unshakable way that only comes when you've been broken, rebuilt yourself, and walked away from the wreckage without needing anyone else's permission to move on. And maybe, just maybe, I'll start something of my own. Not out of spite, but out of possibility. Maybe I'll find a few people like me, the ones who got passed over, pushed aside, told they weren't agile enough, and give them the kind of leadership we all deserved, but rarely got. Because sometimes, the best way to win isn't by beating them at their game. It's by walking away and building your own.